All right. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Um, Today, I really want to talk about somebody incredible here, and it's funny that I'm already saying that. It's funny that I'm saying that he's incredible because I've only just started reading his work. Um, the man that I want to talk about today is Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig was a very dear and close friend to Martin Buber. They did have some disagreements with each other, but as I started reading some of Franz Rosenzweig's work, specifically *The Star of Redemption*, which is his basically his monumental piece, um, probably the magnum opus of his work. I started to see why Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig were friends. I understand why they were friends. Um, I also understand why they don't like Hegel, but actually, Rosenzweig uh, he expresses more clearly, at least to me, why Hegel why he is against Hegel. And I think the best way to summarize, or at least to try to understand why is Rosenzweig against Hegel, we have to understand where Buber and Rosenzweig are coming from. One of the things that one of the reasons why they dislike Hegel is because I would, even though they don't explicitly say this, the reason why they don't like Hegel, I would say, is because Hegel's system, Hegel's philosophy for them, and I'm saying it for them because obviously there's a lot of context, there's a lot of historical context. We have to ask ourselves, how was Hegel taught during the time period that Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber were alive? Um, but the reason why they dislike Hegel is, again, because Hegel's system swallows everything. It encompasses everything. And I have been always struggling with this dilemma myself. But I finally came across a passage in *The Star of Redemption* by Franz Rosenzweig. And to me, it expressed clearly why Rosenzweig is against Hegel. And I want to say that it's not a philosophical argument. It's not a philosophical one, even though it isn't a philosophical piece of work. It's not a philosophical. I would say it's not a philosophical argument. It is a existential argument. It is an existential one. So I want to share this passage that I found very important, kind of inspiring, really, but by Rosenzweig, about why he's sort of against Hegel. And and to preface it, he really, and just like Buber, he really dislikes a lot of the German idealism. And just to give like some preface, like uh, Franz Rosenzweig actually did his dissertation on Hegel. I think it was called like the State and something, Hegel's State and something else. Um, and so he's familiar with Hegel, but it always questions how familiar, and to what emphasis, what emphasis was put in Hegel, right? There's always the argument now that, many people didn't pay attention to Hegel's science of logic. There's always that argument, right? But nonetheless, I still see symptoms today that reveal. I still see symptoms of people that like Hegel, that Franz Rosenzweig is pointing out, and that I have also struggled to express. But I think Rosenzweig beat me here on this. But anyways, I will kind of give a reading of this passage. So this is where it starts. He says the idealistic systems of 1800 display throughout a trait which we would have to designate as one-dimensional. Most clearly Hegel's, but in outline also Fichte's and Schelling's. The individual is not derived immediately from the whole, but rather is developed through its position between the next highest and the next lowest in the system. As, for example, the society for Hegel, in its position between the family and the state. The force of the system as a whole courses through all the individual configurations as a one and universal current. This corresponds exactly to the idealistic view of the world. The almost professionally impersonal quality of philosophers, from Parmenides to Hegel, mentioned in the introduction, also finds its explanation here. The unity of the all is a concept which admits of no other possible point of view than that which just happens to have its turn in the history of philosophical problems. And accordingly, Hegel had to make of the history of philosophy itself the systematic conclusion of philosophy, because thereby the personal point of view of the individual philosopher, the last thing which still seemed able to contradict the unity of the all, was rendered harmless. So, what is Rosenzweig's critique here? I think this is, I like this critique for a couple of reasons. I like this critique because what is the most common? It's basically a meme now in Hegelian, like, well, I won't say in social circles, internet circles, concerning Hegel. What is the common meme? The meme is that if you're against Hegel, you find yourself in Hegel, right? Rosenzweig is against this, right? He's against Hegel for that specific reason, basically, right? Um, and he's against it because the way that Hegel's system functions is that any point of view against Hegel um, vanishes, right? It doesn't do anything to his system, right? It doesn't do anything to it. And so Rosenzweig is kind of disturbed by this because what's happening is that Hegel has done something brilliant in the sense that the individual is something that is in the course of history developing, right? So if it just so happens that there's a philosophy that goes against Hegel, Hegel's system will just says, well, now it's its turn in history to rise up, basically, right? It's now its turn in history to manifest itself. And Rosenzweig is against this because what ends up happening in Rosenzweig's opinion with Hegel is that the individual becomes nothing but a developing cogwheel in the course of history, right? That if there is something special that arises from the individual, well, it was simply history's turn. It was simply the turn of this concept to arise in history, and so in that sense, Hegel's system still persists and runs nice and clean. And so it has this point, I think in many ways I have been trying to express my own existential trouble with this because what ends up happening, and Rosenzweig has really given me a lot of reflection on this, is that as many arguments as we like to propose against Hegel for Hegel, there's always something that Rosenzweig is reminding me of. what we tend to do when we interpret thinkers is that we also tend to strip away the personability, the the philosopher itself. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about the man that is interpreting the philosophical text. We somehow believe when we are sometimes, I mean, I wouldn't say all of us, but sometimes we strip away our own point of view. We say Hegel said this, Rosenzweig said this, uh, and we're defending these impersonal positions. And Rosenzweig has given me this kind of sentimental notion, this really strong existential notion that we can argue all day that Rosenzweig is misinterpreting Hegel. But I think you would be missing the point, actually, because what Rosenzweig is saying is that you are rendering, you are voiding out the philosopher that wants to present something, right? Um, in some sense, you are really not allowing someone to present their view, their contrary view to yours, because what you say in respond to that is you say, "Oh well, yeah, your view is already swallowed up in my system." But you see how impersonal that is, and this is why Buber also had a problem with Hegel, because Hegel's system, in Buber's opinion, basically uh, came down to a monologue, right? It came down to a monologue, and you can see that what Buber and Franz Rosenzweig are making, the arguments that they're making, in my opinion, are existential arguments, not philosophical ones. Because the philosophical ones, you can always say, well, if you look at it, both Buber and Franz Rosenzweig fall into Hegel's system. Yeah, that's fine. But what they're making is existential arguments. They're saying that Hegel has this existential danger of completely silencing the other by saying that you have already fallen into my system, that you're already involved in my system. And so, in some sense, Franz Rosenzweig is saying that Hegel silences us all, right? He silences the philosophers that want to speak against him. And the best way to silence all philosophers that want to speak against him is not by robustly making it impossible. He basically makes it impossible. Yeah, he actually that's correct. He makes it impossible to go against him in some sense, right? That the contrary positions that philosophers can hold against Hegel is rendered harmless, like Franz Rosenzweig said. It's rendered harmless, and you can see this line of thread, this line of thinking today, whether despite the various interpretations of Hegel that we have now, and so on, Franz Rosenzweig is saying that this is the ugly side of it, that it dismisses the other by saying that you are already included. And so, in a very weird way, it's almost like what Franz Rosenzweig is saying is that you're stripping away the tension between a philosopher that has his own view and how he reaches the conclusions of what Hegel has reached. You're stripping that personal philosopher's own view away by saying that it is already a part of the process, right? It's a part of the process, right? Uh, to me, this is a fascinating. It's a fascinating argument. It's an argument that I would say probably never gets taken as seriously because, you know, we have libidinal affection and attachment to the philosophers that we read. And I admit my own, but I think something that both Nietzsche, Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, these great thinkers, these are three thinkers for me that one, I think when I read Nietzsche's Zarathustra, I was in a complete, daze. I just read it so fast. And the same thing with Martin Buber's I and Thou. And I'm having the same affection with The Star of Redemption by Franz Rosenzweig. It's also very poetical and very beautiful. But what both Nietzsche, Martin Buber, and Franz Rosenzweig bring to us is that we can talk philosophers all day. The point for Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, and even Nietzsche, especially if you start taking Nietzsche's notion of creating your own values, is that as much as we want to understand life and everything else, we must understand that that at the end of the day, it's for these thinkers, Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, Nietzsche. At the end of the day, it's about how the philosopher relates to the world. It's how he builds his course in understanding the world. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we forget that it's the way the philosopher builds and threads his understanding with the world and with others. And sometimes the Hegelian system can be so dismissive of that, mainly because what ends up saying to the one that is striving to build and construct threads for itself is that it says to him, oh yes, you're just a part of the process. You're already included, right? It almost negates its own self-striving and struggle, right? Its own real individuality in the process, right? To say it is simply a part of a process, the historical process or the dialectical process. This is how I understand Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, and even Nietzsche when we start talking about creating value specifically. So you can tell this is why I feel like what Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, and Nietzsche say, they don't make philosophical arguments, in my opinion. I feel like they make existential arguments. And so the inspiring thing that I'm already grasping from Franz Rosenzweig is that Franz Rosenzweig is saying that you must conclude the world in your own way. You must do this yourself in some sense, right? And I feel like it's such an important concept because what ends up happening is that we don't understand that when we talk about specific thinkers like Hegel, Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, Nietzsche, we don't understand that it's not really about these thinkers. This is, to me, this is what Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig are teaching me. Even if you can even quote Martin Buber. Martin Buber has this really wonderful quote about, he goes, I didn't teach anything because I didn't teach anything. I simply pointed. We can look at philosophers like pointers to help us build and construct a way for ourselves. But the danger of philosophy is that we tend to use and utilize or weaponize thinkers to block, obfuscate paths, negate otherness of other philosophers that are trying to construct and weave their own relation to themselves in the world. And so when a man speaks about Hegel, he speaks about himself. And when I speak about Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, I speak about myself. This is what I feel like they're really saying. And this is how also I feel like what Nietzsche is saying. But I think when we look at Zarathustra, I think what Nietzsche is trying to say is you have to find a way to speak for yourself. And what does it mean to speak for yourself? This is something that we don't know. This is because you have to think about this, right? All the presuppositions, everything that you're born into, you're born into the world. You're already given something. So what does it mean to speak for yourself? Because everything that you've been born into speaks for you. It's speaking at you. And so these thinkers, we must understand that sometimes when we're arguing about Hegel or Franz Rosenzweig, we're really arguing for the sake of ourselves. And I think this is something that is completely, completely neglected sometimes. I think only, some psychoanalysts kind of understood this, right? Like, you know, uh, Carl Jung. Carl Jung understood this. That he understood that when a man talks philosophy, he speaks about himself. That he is talking his own biography. And in that sense, I am truly resonant with Carl Jung on this. That when a man speaks his philosophy, he's talking about himself. And so, but you see, we have to be careful here, with and thinkers like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig kind of warn us about this, that it's not it's not just speaking your own philosophy. It's allowing the other's philosophy to speak to really speak, to stand on its own ground. And this is why they have a problem with Hegel. Because for Hegel, Hegel's system swallows everything up, right? You're against it, you're in it. You have to be in it to kind of, I guess, be against it, but then it doesn't really allow you a real contrary position, because any real contrary position against Hegel is already included. And so in some sense, the speaker, the man that wants to speak, the man that has aggravations, the man that has frustrations, is silenced. He can't speak for himself because in some sense he has already been spoken for. Again, this is not a philosophical argument that Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig are making. They are making a existential argument against Hegel. And so, but this is also why they can continue to be dismissed in some sense, that they misread Hegel wrong, that they didn't see what Hegel was saying. Now, it could be, but even the interpreters of Hegel can have this capacity to also dismiss the other, to dismiss what Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig are trying to say. And I can translate that into what I am trying to say, that when I speak of these thinkers, it's also what I'm trying to say. It really does raise a lot of questions for me in terms of the process of why certain people pick selective thinkers. And I cannot think of anything else other than a touching moment of that really you're just trying to find a way to speak for yourself. You're trying to find your voice in the world. But in order to find your voice in the world, you have to discover who can possibly speak your language, who possibly speaks what you want to speak, who possibly points to what you're trying to say. And I now understand that really a lot of these thinkers like Martin Buber and now I'm starting to have an affection for Franz Rosenzweig as well. It's funny because they were both close friends and they really, in some sense, loved each other as good friends. You can see that even though, despite their disagreements, they both allowed each other to go their own way, right? But even to allow one to go his own way is also a kind of dialogue. And so, as much as there's dialectical thinking, the things that are also missing is dialogical thinking. And this is kind of what Martin Buber has taught me, and how difficult it is really, that we get caught up in name dropping names. That when I drop a name, I'm simply just saying another version of me. I am saying another version of what I understand. Because as much as we read these thinkers and try to speak for them, we forget that they're also speaking for us. We forget that when we drop a name, Hegel, Nietzsche, Martin Buber, what we're also saying is me. Me, I think this. I think this. Um, we forget that sometimes. We get caught up in the act of speaking for another philosopher. But we have to understand that when we speak for a philosopher, it's in accordance to your understanding and your reasoning, you know? So if it's according to your understanding and your reasoning, you're not necessarily speaking for them, but they're allowing you to speak for yourself. And this is the part that I think we dismiss. We don't really pay attention to this phenomenon that is happening when a man decides to speak and pursue philosophy. Um, but yeah, other than that, I will continue reading The Star of Redemption by Franz Rosenzweig. I really, it's really poetic. It's systematic in a way. It's, yeah, I love it. I definitely understand why Martin Buber loved him. I understand why Franz Rosenzweig liked Martin Buber. These are really two great Jewish thinkers, that it's unfortunate that they only have a niche circle, right? Basically, only Jews would study him in some sense, at least from what I've discovered. Really, they're only mandatory amongst Jewish circles, so they become very niche thinkers. They're not argued for very openly and brought about. But you know, uh, these are things that I attempt to do sometimes. But yeah, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Um, yeah, those are just a lot of things, and hopefully, I can eventually take everything I just said in this video and kind of condense it in an essay, because I feel like it really needs to be also written down. But anyways, thank you guys for watching and take care.